Hello, I'm Louisa Pilbeam. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, appeasing President Donald Trump, NATO member states have endorsed a big new defence spending target. So why did the alliance agree to the massive hike, and can Europe afford it? As Trump's tariffs shut out China from the US, Beijing is looking to other markets. But can local manufacturers from Southeast Asia to Europe compete? And will that reshape global trade? Reform of the global financial system. A group of top economists say changes are needed to help solve the foreign debt crisis in developing nations. But will their call be heeded? It marks a major shift in NATO and a political win for US President Donald Trump. Member states of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization have agreed to raise defense spending to 5% of their GDP. That's more than double the current target. The move will pour billions of dollars into armies, navies and air forces across the alliance. But it raises questions over how governments will foot the bill. With public budgets under strain, many European politicians dismissed the target as unachievable earlier this year when Trump demanded it. However, Europe's priorities now appear to be shifting to security, citing the growing threat from Russia. Hasham Al-Habara reports from The Hague.
A triumphant Trump said that he has achieved what none of his predecessors could do, which is basically to convince NATO members to raise their defense spending to 5% of their GDP. It was crucial for him. It was important to the point where he threatened in the past the United States of America would pull out from NATO if NATO members are not going to bear the burden of NATO spending costs. This is what Trump had to say.
This is a monument really to victory, but it's a monumental win for the United States because we were carrying much more than our fair share. It was quite unfair, actually. But this is a big win for Europe and for actually Western civilization.
NATO members now have 10 years to spend 3.5% of their GDP on hard defense issues such as revamping their military capabilities, acquiring more weapons, missile systems and also air defense systems, and also buying more drones. Then they will have to commit another 1.5% on broader defense-related issues, such as rebuilding their own infrastructure, which they will consider to be part of their defense spending. Baltic states were jubilant.
We are happy, actually. This is historical summit here today and tomorrow because finally we're going to invest more heavily. And you're right, we're talking about the NATO definition defense investments. It's 3.5%, but it's lots more than it was 2% 2014. And adding that 1.5% investments, which is connected to defense.
But there was an exception. The Spanish government decided not to spend more than 2.1% of their GDP on defense spending. They sent a clear message to NATO members that this is an issue of national sovereignty and there's absolutely no way they will commit more money to defense spending. A furious Trump said that he's going to hit Madrid with extra tariffs just because they decided not to follow his key demand. Hashim Al-Habara for Counting the Cost, The Hague.
NATO members have long agreed to allocate 2% of their GDP for defence spending. Some haven't managed to reach that target, though. Let's take a closer look at how much some countries have been spending. The United States tops the list with roughly $967 billion spent in 2024. Germany, Europe's largest economy, is next with about $98 billion. The United Kingdom ranks third with just over $80 billion. France is among the top five with roughly $64 billion allocated to NATO. Poland and Italy are next on the list, spending about $35 billion each. NATO has a total of 32 member states. Countries that have not met the 2% target include Spain, Slovenia, Luxembourg, Belgium and Canada. Well, let's discuss this in detail with Mujtaba Rahman, who is the Managing Director for Europe at the Eurasia Group. He joins us from London now. Mustafa, great to have you on the programme. So is 5% of GDP a reasonable target for NATO countries to spend on their defence budgets? European politicians have previously dismissed this target as unachievable. So why now?
Why now, I think, is because of one man, Donald Trump, in the White House. There was tremendous concern in European capitals that Trump would pull the plug either on Ukraine, a unilateral withdrawal, a deal with Russian President Vladimir Putin that would work against European security interests. So that was a big concern and consideration, but also more broadly about America's commitment to European security through NATO. And so to prevent a unilateral US withdrawal, either from the Ukraine theatre or from NATO, member states have agreed to achieve this 5% target over the medium term.
You mentioned the security threats there. Can Europe afford, though, to spend this amount of money on defence budgets, with Spain, for example, already saying that they cannot afford it?
It really depends where you are in Europe. So the threat perception you have off Russia, countries on the eastern border are already spending a substantial amount of their national income on security and defence. If you're in southern Europe, you've alluded to Spain, that threat perception is a lot less real. And the domestic politics involved in ramping up defence spending to a level that Trump is demanding is much more of a difficult political sell. I think it's also dependent on whether or not countries have the fiscal space. Germany does have the fiscal space. Their new Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, has now decided to abolish the constitutional debt brake for security and defence. So Germany can effectively borrow above 1% of GDP outside of its regular budget with no ceiling for the purposes of security and defence. In their medium-term fiscal plan that was presented yesterday or the day before, they aim to meet this new NATO target by 2029. But other countries do not have the fiscal space. France is a very good example. The government of Francois Bayrou may fall later in the year as they try to pass a budget for 2026 that requires them to achieve around a further 40 billion in savings through spending cuts and tax increases. I think the broader point here is that for Europe collectively to stand up and do more for its own security and defence, that is going to require, I think, more common financing. If you think about what Europe did in response to the coronavirus pandemic with its next generation EU facility, where it issued around 750 billion in additional debt and passed a lot of that onto countries as grants, not loans, to enable them to fight back against COVID. I think something similar will be needed here for security and defence. That will enable countries like Spain, like Italy, and like France to ramp up their defence spending, given they don't have the fiscal space to get there themselves.
And beyond Europe, Canada was also branded a low payer by Trump. Just briefly, are all countries going to be able to meet this target?
No, I don't think they're going to. I think many countries will wait and hope now that Trump will not be in the White House in 4 years' time, and that these spending commitments are ultimately going to be a lot less robust and will not need to be. They will not be accountable for not having met them over the medium term. And as I say, I think for many countries in Southern Europe, that will certainly be the dominant view. For others, I think they will take the threat more seriously. They do think we're moving to a new world order, one where America is less involved. And for that reason, they'll aim to do more and to meet the target themselves.
Mustafa Rahman, Managing Director for Europe at the Eurasia Group, we thank you very much. War is an expensive business. A ceasefire between Iran and Israel is holding for now. Military equipment and deploying troops costs billions of dollars. But how much damage has been done? Israel has been fighting on multiple fronts, including Iran, Lebanon and Gaza. Strikes on Iran are estimated by local media to have cost more than $725 million a day. The nation's war on Gaza alone has cost almost $68 billion by the end of 2024, according to local media. Rebuilding and repairing damage from Iran's strikes could cost Israel at least $400 million, which could further strain its budget for this year. Meanwhile, in Iran, strikes by Israel and the US, including those on nuclear sites, are estimated to cost billions of dollars in damage. The aftermath adds a strain to Iran's defence budget of roughly $12 billion, which is about a third of Israel's budget. All this as Iran's economy struggles from years of Western sanctions. China's trade surplus, the difference between its imports and exports, rose to a record $1 trillion last year. That exceeded any other country in the world, including those of export powerhouses like Germany, Japan or the US. An attempt to slow that tide is one of the reasons behind President Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs. But as the levies effectively closed off the US market, Chinese factories found buyers elsewhere, with their products flooding countries from Southeast Asia to Europe and Latin America. But some of those nations are now worried cheaper Chinese goods will hurt local companies. In May, the value of exports to Europe climbed 12% from a year earlier, while those to Southeast Asian countries rose almost 15%. But China's exports to the US plunged by more than 34% year on year, the sharpest drop since February 2020. Its imports from America were also down. Last month, China's exports grew slower than expected by 5%, reaching $316 billion. The increase in Chinese exports is the result of a government policy aimed at reviving the economy. The nation is struggling with a property crisis and a drop in consumption, among other problems. Government subsidies helped China retail sales grow by 6.4% in May, beating expectations. But economists warn that recovery isn't sustainable. Katrina Yu reports from Beijing.
For fashion-conscious Chinese youth, this newly opened warehouse store in downtown Beijing has become a must-visit destination. Here, thousands of luxury handbags are for sale, without the premium price tag. That's because they're all second-hand.
In the past, I didn't buy second-hand things. I felt things used by others weren't so desirable. But now I think they're more cost-effective.
As the country's economic growth slows, shoppers in major Chinese cities are spending less and increasingly looking for deals offered by stores like this.
Living a low-carbon lifestyle and buying used things has become more fashionable for this new generation of young people.
The trend is pushing down consumer prices, which fell by 0.1% in May compared to the year before.
Chinese shoppers used to need to go overseas to Europe or Japan to buy second-hand luxury goods. The growing popularity of stores like this reflects a larger change in Chinese spending habits.
Uncertainty about the future, including trade tensions with the United States, has spurred fears about job security and pushed households to save more of their income. It's triggered price wars in some sectors, particularly the auto industry, and sparked fears of entrenched deflation.
The deflation is a permanent phenomenon at this point because the competition between producers is so fierce.
Last month, government trade-in subsidies and e-commerce discounts led to an unexpected increase in retail sales of 6.4%. Collectible toys have surged in popularity, with many lining up to snap up versions of a character called Labubu. Analysts say those under financial pressure are opting to buy items that make them feel good, distracting them from bigger purchases they can't afford.
Labubu or the cosmetics or secondhand luxury bags, they look like they cost a lot, but actually they're not. On average, they're just mediocre consumption comparing to large items like cars, right, or housing.
Many experts believe consumer sentiment will remain weak unless larger problems, such as the crisis in the property sector, are resolved. For now, though, many Chinese consumers are chasing the best deal, spending as little as they can when it comes to where they travel, what they eat, and what they wear. Katrina Yu for Counting the Cost in Beijing.
Fraser Howie is a China and Asia analyst and co-author of Red Capitalism and Privatising China. He joins us now from Edinburgh in the UK. So, Fraser, thank you for being on the programme. Let's take a closer look then at the countries that China is turning to now. And will these countries face a conflict of interest with the need to maintain US trade relations?
Well, certainly, as for the countries they're turning to, first of all, I think basically every country, if one market closes, they're going to try and sell their goods and flood their goods, frankly, into all these other markets, whether it be in Latin America, whether it be in Southeast Asia, into Europe, Africa, wherever. So they're going to try and find new markets to pick up any US slack. But also what they're doing is they're simply routing their goods through those third countries to try and sell into America. So remember, trade is very globalized. Almost for any given product, it's extremely globalized. And so simply to look as America versus China or at that bilateral relationship is only a small part, an important part, but it's only a small part of the global trade framework.
So can China then rely on those exports, those new markets, to make up for the loss in US markets?
Well, no, not really, because ultimately, while they're sort of new markets, they're trying to send even more goods into those places, but they're not new. New countries have not appeared. China's been selling to these countries already. What they're doing, though, is they're just diverting their goods that were going to the States, or parts of some of the goods that were going to the States, into those other countries, driving prices down. But as your report and as you've alluded to, there's pressure in those countries as well. They don't want to be flooded by Chinese goods. It's going to affect their own industries. It's going to drive down prices. They're going to increase dependency on China at a time when Trump has signaled very clearly that China is the threat and that is his focus. How he goes about tackling that, you can argue about, but that's certainly what he's made clear, that China is the enemy in Trump's eyes.
Let's talk about flooding markets then with Chinese goods. How concerned will other countries be about so-called Chinese dumping, where cheaper goods from China put local businesses perhaps out of business?
Yeah, this is a huge problem, and it has been for a long time. There's plenty of evidence out of Africa, certainly, where small traders have been squeezed out of business, small manufacturers, small producers. And of course, the post-World War II story of Southeast Asia and many developing markets was moving up that manufacturing chain, exploiting low-cost labor to move into textiles and then move on to the other things. China, of course, has basically stopped that process. It's almost the end point in that process, that no other country can compete with China's scale. And also remember that for many industries in China and many manufacturing export industries, they're being heavily subsidized by the state. So it's China's government is interested in production, just in producing stuff and then flooding the market. That then drives other countries' businesses out of business. They make no money, they have to close down, they don't get the same level of subsidies. And you're left with being very dependent on China in a whole host of matters. That's not just true in developed countries, it's becoming ever more true in developing countries as well.
Fraser, do we already have a new global trade order? And who is ultimately going to rewrite the new trade rules?
Well, I think what's very clear is that the old trade order under sort of the GATT and then the WTO, this idea that free trade is the solution to all our problems, that order is very much finished. And it's becoming very clear to many nations now that China's dominant role, while it's been great in some ways, it's kept all our prices low for many goods, it's improved the Chinese economy for a time, but that has a limited and a finite lifetime. And that things need to change. The old order no longer works. China will become or will remain very important as a trade partner. It simply produces too much stuff. It's not going to disappear. But writing new rules requires that the Germans, the Europeans, the Americans, everybody comes together and says that the China model is not, this mercantilist model is simply not acceptable to the rest of the world, and things need to change. And that's going to require tariffs, it's going to require trade barriers. And like I say, the old model is broken. The new one is less defined.
A fascinating conversation. Fraser Howey, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
More than 3 billion people live in countries that spend more on repaying their debt than on health or education. The UN says 54 developing countries now spend more than 10% of their tax revenues on interest payments. The deepening debt crisis is threatening to derail progress on poverty reduction and climate goals in some developing nations. In a new report, a group of leading economists backed by the Vatican are calling for a reform of lending rules to help solve the problem. The report was commissioned by the late Pope Francis as a way to explore how developing countries could tackle the debt crisis. Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz is one of more than 30 experts weighing in. They've called for debt relief programmes and the expansion of the heavily indebted poor countries, or HIPC initiative. Launched in the 1990s, the initiative saw around $100 billion of debt written off. Deuda Sembene is CEO of the Global Development Advisory Afri Catalyst and is one of the authors of the Jubilee Reports. He joins us from Dakar. Deuda, what action specifically is this report calling for?
On this report that was commissioned by Vatican and that is written by a number of leading experts chaired by Professor Stiglitz, has been calling for actions to address the current debt crisis and development crisis that is affecting the developing countries and the global south in general. As you indicated, there are more than 3.3 billion people who live in countries that are spending more time servicing their debt than on healthcare or education. This also means that there is not only a debt crisis and a financial crisis, but there is also a social crisis, because as long as those countries are not able to meet the needs of their population, chances are there is they won't be able to improve their living conditions. So what we call for in our report is action, not only right now to address both the development and debt crisis, but also address the root of the crisis, which actually you can find in the global financial system, so that actually even if the debt crisis is addressed right now, it won't happen again in the future, as was the case back in the 90s when there was the HIPC that you mentioned.
So change is clearly urgently needed, but how ambitious is this call when developing nations already have huge debt and the borrowing needs are still there?
Yeah, and definitely, actually, we try to balance ambition and realism. Of course, we are in a situation right now where there is a lot of dissent against traditional development finance model. And definitely, when you call for some sort of debt restructuring or debt relief, you might face some sort of headwinds. But I think what we also recognize is this situation is a situation that is a shared responsibility between the debtor countries, the creditor, and also the international financial institution. So yes, you can be very ambitious in trying to address this, but this is needed. This ambition is needed, because the reality is, if those countries in the global south are not able to address these challenges, not only they will, of course, their population will suffer from it, but they may also have a global repercussion on various areas that I don't need to cite right here.
So you have the borrowers and you have the lenders. So from the creditors' perspective, what changes are being called upon there? Responsible lending, interest rates?
Yes, so definitely we felt that creditors have their role to play in addressing the debt crisis. And it starts with, of course, being more responsible in lending. What we have seen is many creditors have shown some sort of recklessness in providing lending, when even they knew that the borrower might actually experience a problem down the road in servicing the debt. They have been, of course, also engaging some of them in predatory lending. So it starts by being responsible and actually providing quality lending. Second, it also means that if you are lending to countries that are currently serving or experiencing problems in servicing their debt, you also need to participate in effort to make sure that that country can actually get back to their feet and be able to service their debt on their side, but at the same time respond to all the critical needs that their population are facing. It means that those creditors need to participate in efforts to restructure the debt and do it in a way in good faith, but also at the same time, of course, we also understand that borrowers also have to play their part by showing some restraint in borrowing, but also making sure that they also engage into responsible borrowing and making sure that they also take the reforms efforts that are actually needed to help avoid the recurrence of this debt crisis in the future.
Deuda Sembene, an important discussion. Good to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now let's turn to aviation. Boeing stocks have dipped recently as the American aerospace manufacturer investigates the recent Air India crash. The incident is the latest in a series of setbacks faced by the plane maker, which has taken a back seat in the aviation industry. Katia Lopez-Horoyan has the story.
Boeing is hoping to turn around years of turmoil. The American aerospace manufacturer is dealing with a long list of recent crashes, delays, and safety concerns. It lost nearly $12 billion last year, marking the company's worst financial performance since 2020. The hit on its reputation and sales was clear at this year's Paris Air Show, where top names in aviation display, show off, and sell their latest products. Boeing scaled down its presence. Just days before the show, one of Boeing's Air India planes crashed, killing 260 people. Adding to the company's troubles is the Alaska Airlines door plug that came loose mid-flight last year before making an emergency landing.
Safety is absolutely paramount for passengers. You realize that reputation is very important for all players in the aviation sector, whether they're manufacturers or airlines.
Some clients are turning to other companies like Airbus. The largest aerospace company in Europe took in new models and new orders, clinching nearly $21 billion in sales at the Paris Air Show. Global wars and conflicts are also fueling sales in aviation, with some governments looking to boost their defense. And tariffs are yet another concern.
I think the trade barriers and the supply chain and the global nature of the supply chain is probably very conscious. Everybody's conscious at the moment. One of the sort of research things that's coming through is the ability to additively manufacture in more than one material.
Despite its list of troubles, Boeing still has a backlog of more than 5,000 orders from both commercial and defense contracts. Katia Lopez-Horoyan, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
And that is our show for this week. Do get in touch with us on X. I'm at Louisa Pilbeam TV, and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online, of course, at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Louisa Pilbeam from the whole team. Thank you for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is up next.